Welcome to GRE. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Learn how the misery of inflation is altering both your quality of life and the return on all of your investments. Also, many people are now having their mortgage payments double overnight, and it's creating pain. Then, what are the factors affecting the future direction of rents? All that and more today on Get Rich Education.
Since 2014, the powerful Get Rich Education podcast has created more passive income for people than nearly any other show in the world. This show teaches you how to earn strong returns from passive real estate investing in the best markets without losing your time being a flipper or landlord. Show host Keith Weinhold writes for both Forbes and Rich Dad Advisors and delivers a new show every week. Since 2014, there's been millions of listener downloads in 188 world nations. He has A-list show guests include top-selling personal finance author Robert Kiyosaki. Get Rich Education can be heard on every podcast platform, plus it has its own dedicated Apple and Android listener phone apps. Build wealth on the go with the Get Rich Education podcast. Sign up now for the Get Rich Education podcast or visit GetRichEducation.com.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to GRE. You're listening to one of the longest running and most listened to shows on real estate investing. This is Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold, the voice of real estate since 2014. I don't know if you fully realize how much inflation is steering all of your investments, and it's emphatic at a time like this when the dollar is down 25% cumulatively in just the last 4 years. Gosh. And that's the official CPI number. The real number is probably higher than that. And I've got some jaw-dropping inflation facts to share with you soon. We'll get to inflation's real estate effects shortly, but here's what I mean. In stocks, really, they keep riding up this wave of optimism. They're anticipating a Fed interest rate cut, largely due to future inflation expectations. Yes, there's jobs and GDP and some other factors, but the stock market, which is a forward-looking market, it often moves based on what's expected to happen 6 or 12 months from now. It's future-looking, down the road. Stock investors know that rate cuts will open the floodgates to get us closer to the easy money days again that stock investors want so bad. And that's why, as backwards as this whole thing is, the worse the economy looks, the lower that inflation tends to be, and then in turn, the lower that interest rates can go, which the stock market likes. So a worsening economy often pumps up the stock market. So counterintuitive, so backwards. Just look at what happens historically. Recessions sound bad, yet what happens is that rates get cut in a recession because the economy needs the help. But nearer term, it's this ongoing expectation of the rate cut that's been looming out there for months, but it hasn't happened, which absolutely can keep propelling the stock market to higher highs. It's already hit all-time highs here recently, and that's why you can make the case that stocks very well could and even should keep floating higher from here based on that premise. Before we look at real estate and inflation, understand this. Inflation has already widened the divide between the affluent and the deprived. Well, that divide has gone from a gully out to a canyon. But my gosh, here's the stat that I want to share with you. And you're really going to get a sense for the gravity of what you're living through in this decade. We've already seen more inflation in just the first 51 months of this 2020s decade than we have in the entire decade of the 2010s. Yeah, already. And this gets really interesting. Let's look at about the last 4 decades here. All right. In the 1990s decade, America had 34% cumulative inflation. Let's go ahead and we'll associate this decade with President Bill Clinton then. And we won't tie any president to the inflation number because there are lag effects and other factors. The president really can't take the credit or blame in most cases, just marking the era here. All right, so 34% inflation in the 1990s, and then the 2000s decade, that saw the GFC and 29% inflation. Most of those were the George W. Bush years. The 2010s decade came around, and that saw lower inflation, just 19%. So that's under 2% a year. These were mostly the Obama years here in the 2010s.
I have no more campaigns to run. My only agenda, I know because I won both of them.
Oh, yeah, a little flex there from the former commander-in-chief. All right, then after that, into the 2020s decade, where we are now. Okay, they have seen, like I alluded to, and under Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., yes, as the oldest sitting president ever, it's easy to forget that he's a junior. In this young 2020s decade, we have 21% cumulative inflation already. So this figure is after just the first 51 months of this decade, if we're counting from 2020. And this is largely due to supply shortages from the COVID pandemic. So 21% already in this decade and just 19% all of last decade, which was a full decade, of course. So that is the impact. That's reflective of what you see in home prices and rent prices and higher costs for utilities, transportation, labor, and almost every facet of your life, and even what you see in your weekly Costco bill and Trader Joe's bill. What have we left out here, though? A one-term president so far? Does somebody feel left out? Oh, yes, that is the actual person of one Donald John Trump.
The energy is what caused this massive inflation that we've suffered through. And then everything caught on. I mean, do you ever see bacon where it went up four times over a course of 3 years? So I don't eat bacon anymore. It's too expensive.
Oh, jeez. All of those figures that I cited are from the BLS, and I've been rounding you to the nearest whole percent. But get this. Inflation over the next 40 years, that could make the last 40 years seem like a picnic. And that's partly because we are $35 trillion in debt. And that figure now grows by $1 trillion about every single quarter, every 90 to 100 days. Our debt load grows by another $1 trillion. So we must keep dollar printing in order to pay it back. My gosh. But just listen to this. If the last 40 years repeats itself, by the year 2064, which is in 40 years, we will see these prices. Prepare yourself for a future that looks like this. Gas at $13.38 per gallon. The home price, an average home at $1.88 million. The average rent at $59,000 per year, and the average salary at $104,000. That's what you can expect. That is if inflation over the next 40 years looks like that of the last 40 years. My gosh. And also note there, how salaries don't seem to keep pace with prices. That $104K average salary in the year 2064 at this pace, that doesn't sound as high-flying as those other figures. Well, this is all really frustrating for consumers and even debilitating to one's standard of living. And remember, this latest wave of inflation brought us the biggest year-over-year increase in homelessness based on HUD figures. And why you need to invest in something that reliably benefits from inflation and pays you an income at the same time. That's the importance of aligning your strategy that way. And look, here's really the deal. Dollars are abundant. So then, isn't it a paradox that a major spike in the supply of dollars would create more homelessness? Well, you know that dollars are there for your taking because so many more have been brought into existence. Dollars are abundant. So as they cycle through the economy, rather than going through the typical consumer motions, instead you can build your diverter. That's where the world of abundance exists. So build that diverter, get into that flow, that cycle of dollars. Ultimately, real capital is scarce. Your time and energy are scarce. Natural resources are scarce. Labor is scarce. What's frustrating with all this is that money ought to reflect that scarcity if it is going to accurately convey the value that enables people to make capital accumulation decisions. And alas, we're doing our measuring in dollars here, and the dollar is not remotely scarce. The middle class and poor often have wages that don't track inflation, yet they disproportionately suffer the higher consumer prices. The investor class owns assets that float up with inflation, and GRE listeners will do even better than that, because as income property owners with mortgages, we're winning three ways at the same time with the inflation triple crown. That's your dollar diverter. All right, so that's longer term inflation. I've been talking in terms of decades here, both the past and with an extrapolation into the future there, 2064, and that's really rather sobering. Well, what's the more current inflation situation? The situationship, if we will. What's the situationship now? In trying to quiet it down to their 2% target, the Fed has run into so many hurdles that you'd think they were training for this summer's Olympics in Paris. After it peaked over 9% 2 full years ago now, inflation's been bouncing near 3.5% for a year, and they just keep having trouble getting it lower than that. And, would we say that this could turn into Jerome Powell's 3/4 life crisis? We'll see. Rising inflation is one of the key factors that brought down the Roman Empire. They famously experienced hyperinflation after a series of emperors lowered the silver content of their currency called the denarius. I don't think we're going to run into hyperinflation anytime soon, if at all. But today, some lament that the dollar isn't backed by gold. It's not backed by silver or backed by anything else. But it is backed by other things. It's backed by the world's most powerful military and strongest economy and reserve currency status. And the dollar is backed by international trade agreements. And you also must pay your taxes in dollars. Dollars are still liquid. Dollars are still useful, but just perpetually debased. So get them because they're useful, but then transition out of them. And despite all that and that power that we project out of the world, at the same time, we are the greatest debtor nation in the history of the world. And the easiest way for the U.S. to pay it all back is to simply print more and inflate more. And that's why it is almost inevitable that dollars will keep being worth less. And by the way, have you ever thought about it? The two words worth less sound awfully close to the word worthless. That's where we keep heading. So until you can send a Venmo request to the Fed to compensate you for your loss in purchasing power, you're actually going to need to do something about this that's feasible and within your reach. And yes, the dollar that you had when you started listening to me today could very well be now only worth 99 cents. We can either have our standard of living degraded by inflation, or we will decide to be intentional and profit from it. So if you haven't yet, check out getricheducation.com/triple crown. rather than impoverish you, learn how you can make inflation create wealth for you 3 ways at the same time with that free 3-part Inflation Triple Crown video series if you haven't seen it yet. Some really good learning there. It's free and easy to watch. Again, at getricheducation.com/triple crown. Inflation seemingly seeps into everything. Inflation took down the commercial sector, apartment buildings and offices and more. Apartments are down 30 to 40% in the last 2 years. That's how much value they've lost. And it's all because inflation made the Fed basically panic and jack up those rates. If that's not jaw-dropping enough, office values are down 80% plus in the last 2 years. 80% plus, even 90% plus in some cases. And of course, office real estate got the double whammy of the inflation-induced interest rate hikes and the work from anywhere movement. Well, that leaves residential 1 to 4 unit properties in good standing, and they're still impacted by inflation, but much less so impacted by inflation than a lot of the other segments are. Yeah, your 1 to 4 unit rents are up, and I'll talk more about rent later in the show today. Inflation also jacked up your expenses like insurance, utilities, maintenance and repair costs, and more. But as we move away from the inflation conversation now, of course, one big reason that 1 to 4s have stayed resilient is the American privilege of long-term fixed interest rate debt, and the fact that it's 30 years for most U.S. properties. That is the envy of the world. And in fact, in 2022, in the U.S., 89% of home buyers, they applied for the 30-year. And I think that you're about to get more appreciation for this, perhaps, than you've ever had. The 30-year fixed-rate mortgage is a uniquely American construct. Unique. And by the way, some people don't seem to know what the word unique means. You probably heard people misusing this word all the time. Unique does not mean something that's different or sort of different. Unique means one of a kind. Unique means something that does not exist anywhere else. Yeah, what do I do here on this show? Besides giving you the occasional geography lesson as a side dish to your real estate investing, I also do some of this with vocabulary, grammar, and syntax as well, don't I? Even though my own is surely imperfect. Anyway, the reason that the 30-year mortgage can even exist, that is because of our deep financial markets, especially our secondary market for mortgage-backed securities, where your loan gets packaged up and purchased by a bond investor, a bit like Ridge Lending Group President Shaylee Ridge and I touched on here last week. One reason that mortgage-backed securities are attractive to investors in the U.S. and really across the globe is because of their government sponsorship. That makes them safe investments over long periods of time. And they also provide a fixed payout to the mortgage-backed security holder. It's just another reason that they're attractive. And see, the rate on the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, that tracks closely to 10-year treasuries because U.S. real estate is almost as good of an investment as a U.S. Treasury bond is. That safety is there. They've got Fannie and Freddie insurance, and that entire MBS process, it now has more guardrails in it than we had before the global financial crisis. We are talking about the foundation here, really, of where you get your big lumps of money from, the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage and its uniqueness. Compared to the world, let's look at some other nations here shortly. Compared to the world, the U.S. has very little variable rate debt. Less than 4% of American mortgage borrowers have debt that's on rate terms of a year or less. Over 96% of U.S. debt is long-term fixed-rate debt defined as 10 years or more, and that is virtually unparalleled worldwide. To compare us to some other developed nations, mortgage borrowers in, just say, Germany, they have 47% with long-term fixed-rate debt, and none of them in Germany can get 30-year debt. Long-term debt, again, defined as 10 years or more, that is little to zilch for mortgage borrowers in Canada, the UK, Ireland, Italy, Sweden, Finland, Australia, and other developed nations like them. Even in Canada, the most common mortgage terms reset to the prevailing market interest rate every 5 years. And in Finland, their mortgages reset annually or faster. I mean, gosh, can you imagine if your mortgage interest rate reset every year like it does for the Finns? Sheesh, that's more often than some people lose the remote control or rearrange their furniture. All right, so what does this really mean? You might think, oh, that's interesting, but what does it really mean? You got to kind of pour one out for most mortgage borrowers in the rest of the world. They can't lock in their mortgage interest rate for the long term. So with rates doubling or tripling starting from 3 years ago, it has totally ruined a lot of foreign homeowners or severely crimped their lifestyle. I mean, look, what if you're middle class and your monthly mortgage payment for your family soars from, say, $1,893 on Tuesday up to $3,415 on Wednesday. Well, that's what's happening elsewhere. It can go up 50% overnight. It can nearly double overnight in Australia, Europe, and other places. But in the mortgage advantage U.S., we are safe. If we buy at, say, an 8% mortgage rate on a 30-year fixed amortizing loan today, just the plain regular vanilla loan, well, down the road, if rates rise to 10%, you're happy to be locked in at 8%. And if rates fall to 6% later, you will refinance. And note that I intentionally refrain from saying you just refinance. I don't like the word just there because you're still going to need hours to provide documentation for your mortgage loan underwriter, and your credit score will be checked and things like that, but it is worth it. So you won't just refinance, you'll refinance. So think of it this way then. You can alter your deal with the bank whenever you want to, and usually with no prepayment penalty either. So you can alter it on them, but yet the bank can't alter it on you. What did Darth Vader say to Lando Calrissian in one of the Star Wars movies? I think it was The Empire Strikes Back. I'm altering the deal. Pray that I don't alter it any further. We better not play that clip here. I don't know the copyright laws with Lucasfilm or Disney there. Well, the point is, you are not the Dark Lord of the Sith for doing that, for altering the deal on the bank. You are playing within the rules. And this is almost an unfair advantage for Americans. The bottom line here, with this unique American advantage, this privilege really, is that as rates change over time, and they always will be going up and always will be going down and bouncing around, as that happens, you get to play both sides of the game. And that's why we add smart properties with loans. We turn that into wealth with compound leverage. Now, as for mere compound interest, that's a vehicle for you to rely on more for your shorter term funds, your cash, or what you're keeping more liquid. Long-term wealth is built through compound leverage. Short-term funds, that's for compound interest. And your bank is getting rich off of you if you're not attentive, because the national average bank account pays less than 1% on your savings. So if your money isn't making about 4 or 5% today, you're losing your hard-earned cash to inflation. What I do is I keep my dollars in a private liquidity fund. You can do this too. Your cash generates up to an 8% return with compound interest year in and year out, instead of earning less than 1% sitting in your bank account or even 4 or 5% elsewhere. The minimum investment is just $25K, and you keep getting paid until you decide you want your money back. This private liquidity fund has a decade-plus track record, and they've always paid back their investors 100% in full and on time. And I would know because I'm an investor in this myself. See what it feels like to earn 8%. A lot of other GRE listeners have. To learn more, you can just text the word family to 66866 to learn more about Freedom Family Investments Liquidity Fund. Get 8% interest. Just do it right now while you're thinking about it. Text family to 66866. More straight ahead, including what's happening with rents. I'm Keith Weinhold. You're listening to Get Rich Education. For a lender that's a specific expert with income property, you need Ridge Lending Group, NMLS 42056. In GRE history, from beginners to veterans, they provided our listeners with more mortgages than anyone. It's where I get my own loans for single-family rentals up to fourplexes. Start your pre-qualification and chat with President Chaley Ridge personally. They'll even customize a plan tailored to you for growing your portfolio. Start at ridgelendinggroup.com, ridgelendinggroup.com.
What's up, everyone? This is HGTV's Tariq El Musa. Listen to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold, and don't quit your daydream.
Welcome back. You're listening to episode 503 of Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. We've got a poll result from our Get Rich Education Instagram page. The poll question was really simple. When buying property, what's more important, the purchase price or the mortgage rate? 71% of you said the purchase price, 29% of you said the mortgage rate. Of course, both are important, but I think that the purchase price is the best answer because your purchase price stays fixed for the life of your ownership period, and you can change your fixed rate mortgage and make it malleable whenever it suits your needs. As we talk about where the opportunity is today, though multifamily apartments, they're going to bottom out sometime and head up at some point. They'll be a wise investment again. Who really knows when? Maybe the time for larger apartments is soon. One opportunity is giving good people options during a housing affordability crisis. Think about what you're doing that way. And what's going on now is that, let me put it this way, when people have a hard time affording to purchase their own home today, basically what people are doing is they are having a hard time transitioning from resenting their landlord over to bickering with an HOA. That is kind of how the world works. Seemingly everyone would rather be bickering with an HOA than they would resenting their landlord. A lot of renters want to be buyers. They can't, and that is not expected to change anytime soon, as prices are likely going to stay elevated and then mortgage rates are staying higher longer too. Now, these things, they're almost knowns. It's often wise to invest in trends that are known. Nothing is completely predictable, but when you're looking for a place to park your investment dollars, a few other things are known right now. Think about this as your long-term investor perspective. And AI is not expected to change what I'm about to tell you anytime soon. VR, virtual reality, that's not about to change what I'm going to tell you anytime soon. AR, augmented reality, isn't either. Machine learning won't imminently disrupt this. And that is, everyone expects more long-term inflation. Virtually everyone. At what rate? No one knows. People will need to live somewhere. That's known. And there are not a lot of places to live. That's known. Those three facts right there are so simple. And I love simple. One reason I love simple things is that I can remember it that way. So many investors in all types of things, say from tech ETFs to junior mining stocks to crypto. Okay, you can make money there, but at times investors will unnecessarily go out onto the risk curve and guess and speculate at some future trend. And sometimes they're right, and sometimes they're wrong. And adopting too much of that approach, that's exactly when your risk-adjusted return goes down throughout your investor life. Instead, you actually can get great returns. You don't have to sacrifice returns. You can get great returns within this paradigm that's already known. Real estate pays 5 ways type of returns in these trends that I just described that are near certainties. So why guess when instead you can be nearly certain? And oftentimes the certain thing is just right there in front of you. It's sort of too obvious. It's often easier, like I think I brought up on the show once before, inspired by Jeff Bezos. Don't ask what will change in 10 years. The more insightful question and profitable question that fewer people think to ask is actually, what will be the same in 10 years? Well, when we talk about rents and the fact that tenants will keep paying you to live somewhere 10 years from now, the trend that's taking place here in the mid-20s decade that we're in, here in the mid-2020s, is that rents are increasing the most where there hasn't been enough new supply added. Rents are up 5 to 6% in parts of the Northeast, including New York and Boston, Seattle too, and parts of the Midwest. Detroit and Honolulu rents are each up about 5%, some of the stronger markets right now, and rents have declined where they've added a whole lot of new supply recently, including Austin, Texas, and Miami, where they're down 3% or more in each of those markets. New Orleans is another major city that's down at minus 1%. But among the larger cities, Austin, Texas is the worst performer in the nation right now. And if you're listening to this either this week or you're listening to this, say, 10 years from today, if you want to know future rent trends, look at where they're adding supply, especially in apartments. But all these new apartments, they will fill up, and nationally, they're building fewer apartments this year than last year's apartment building boom. When we talk about rents and who owns single-family homes, really, there are a few myths that I want to help bust for you here. There seems to be this misconception or misinformation that gigantic Wall Street firms are buying up all of the single-family rentals, and that is just not true. Now, there is more participation from the big firms than there has been historically, but let's break this down. Let's parse this. Among those that own 1 to 9, between 1 and 9 single-family rentals, which we'll call that our definition of mom and pop investors, that constitutes 80% of the market. So 80% own 1 to 9 units, and now you might own more than 9. In fact, 14% are in that next tier up, owning between 10 and 99 single-family rentals. And then 3%, which are known as small national investors here, they own between 100 and 1,000. And what's left are the big institutional investors, those that own 1,000 or more single-family rentals. And you've heard of some of these companies: Invitation Homes. Another is called American Homes for Rent, Progress Residential, Blackstone, First Key Homes. All of those big players and more, the big institutional ones that own 1,000 units or more, all of them combined own just 3% of the market. So again, 80% are the small players, the mom and pops, making this a highly fractured market. And there are a total of 82 million single-family homes in the United States. And out of all of those, do you have any idea what percent are owner-occupied and how many are rentals? It is 83% owner-occupied and 17% of the single families are rentals. So about 1/6 of single-family homes are rented out. That's a more concise way to say it. Now, here's the thing. Some people tend to think of mom and pop single-family rental operators as unsophisticated charity case workers who never raise the rents. That is part of the perception out there, but that narrative's really never been true. And in fact, the COO of American Homes for Rent, his name's Brian Smith, he recently brought up this key point on their recent earnings call. He said that while historically, mom and pops, they hadn't always priced directly to the market because of a lack of market data, what they've done is they've really migrated into a strategy that's closer to the big institutional players. Well, how is this and why is this? anymore, why are mom and pops raising rents just about as aggressively as the big institutional players? It's really just the simple fact of the increased transparency on the rents that landlords are asking for through internet listing sites like Zillow. And it's not that mom and pops didn't increase the rents in an earlier era. I mean, just look at what happened with rising rents in the 1970s and 80s before the institutional investors were in the sector. But when there's a lack of rent amount transparency, it took longer for operators to sort of price discover and adjust to market pricing, especially for those smaller players in this deeply fragmented market. But that's the part that's changing. See, though increased transparency, it works both ways. If you're, say, a mom and pop or a smaller investor, it's good for you and it's bad for you because the information helps tenants too. So in upswing markets, operators like you might push rents faster than you would otherwise, but in a downtrending market, as an operator, you might cut or keep rents flat faster in order to get your unit leased because tenants can easily see what other landlords are charging and they can compare the features. So when you price too high, units sit vacant and don't generate any income. And since renters benefit from this increased transparency too, if they see two similar homes, they're usually going to pick the better deal. And this greater transparency, that's really why new lease rent growth is cooling off. In fact, CoreLogic just released their latest single-family rent index report last week. It showed that nationally rents are up 3.4%, which coincidentally happens to be the same as the latest CPI inflation number. Detached properties, they're seeing more rent growth than attached ones like townhomes. And if you think about it, that makes sense. Townhomes are in somewhat less demand now. Because the homeownership dream, that's really when one moves out of the attached apartment and buys a detached house. And since that transaction is so unaffordable here in the 2020s decade, that's why more people are willing to pay more to rent the detached type. But note that rent growth has moderated since mortgage rates spiked, and that further dispels this sticky myth that rents boom when home prices fall. That's not true. Remember, when home price growth is really hot, like it was in 2021 and 2022, it was up nearly 15%. Well, rent growth tends to be hot too. It was also near 15% for a time back then. And then when home price growth is moderate like it is now, well, rent price growth is pretty moderate too. So the point is that prices and rents move together. It's just more evidence for that. Those two things are positively correlated. Some people think they move inversely, and all we're doing is looking at history over hunches again. What really happens here? So though you're almost certainly going to get nominal rent growth over time, it's not a good thing for you to count on it in the short term, but it never is anyway in any era. The time for you to push rents is, of course, in any market when you go for new leases between tenants. A new lease with a new tenant that's going to be higher than a renewal lease. It's the old, hey, well, this has been a good tenant for 3 years, so I don't want to push the rent too hard and lose them. That sort of thing. To review what you've learned today, inflation is affecting all of your investments. 30-year fixed-rate mortgages are a unique American advantage. It's wise to invest in future trends that are known. If you want to know what is going to happen with rents in the near future, look where they've added supply and where they haven't. Less new supply correlates with more rent growth, and large institutional investors own just 3% of single-family rentals. Well, hey, if you enjoy the show, please tell a friend about it. Gosh, I had Isaiah on LinkedIn. He left the most flattering comment. Over there, he wrote and called GRE the best podcast on the planet. I don't really think I can take credit for that, though. I know I can. I'd like to think that we're a good, reliable resource, even an indispensable one for building your wealth through real estate investing and regularly informing you, giving you ideas that you never thought about before that add real value to your life. You've heard of Bidenomics. The first portmanteau type that I ever heard about a president's economic policies is Reaganomics, though it was a little before my time. Here on the show next week with us will be none other than the father of Reaganomics. Yes, late President Ronald Reagan's budget director will be here next week. Basically, he was Reagan's money guy. His name is David Stockman, and he often met with the president in the Oval Office, advising Reagan on economic affairs. I have asked David Stockman if, besides talking about the condition of today's economy on the show next week, he'll also discuss real estate, and he agreed to do so. That's the father of Reaganomics. You can look forward to he and I together next week here on the show. You might be one of the listeners that's been here every single week with me since 2014, just like I've been here for you. A new podcast is published every Monday. If you want more from us, our Don't Quit Your Daydream email letter is published and sent about weekly, and that's typically been on Thursdays lately. And then finally, there are many new videos published each month over on our Get Rich Education YouTube channel. Those are the main three places that you can find us. Until next week, if you enjoyed listening, I'd really appreciate it if you just simply told a friend about the Get Rich Education podcast. Until then, I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.